Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Morris at the University of Notre Dame, and welcome to this Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship webinar on the role of faith in the ventures of the poor. Um, our conversation today will feature two renowned scholars in this area who I'll introduce in a little bit, but I wanted to do a little table setting before we begin the conversation. So I'm going to share my slides. So, our focus today is the interface between three kinds of experiences: the experience of poverty, the entrepreneurial experience, and the faith experience. So, to briefly touch on each of these. If we think about venture creation, it is a complex, unpredictable, uncontrollable, messy, chaotic, nonlinear process. Importantly, it's a process of adaptation. It's an emergent process where what gets created is often quite different from what one intended to create in the first place. I highlight this because of the importance of adaptation, of learning on the fly, of the ability to engage in trial and error and adjust what one's doing. So, what happens when somebody pursues this experience, the venture creation experience, and they come from a poverty background? The challenge in poverty is that it's much, much more than a lack of income. It's a multidimensional phenomenon that can include substandard housing, a constant threat of eviction, chronic health challenges, shorter lifespans, poorer diets, substandard schools and higher school dropout rates, physical insecurity due to crime, social exclusion, high rates of teen pregnancy, high rates of single parenthood, constant fatigue and stress, lack of transportation, the lack of entrepreneurial role models, limited social networks, underemployment. What are the implications of the multiple dimensions of poverty, the experience of poverty? How does that affect somebody when they try to start a business? Well, here we talk, in entrepreneurship, we talk about the liabilities of newness and smallness. To this, we add the liability of poorness. So the additional obstacles faced by the low income or disadvantaged entrepreneur translate into literacy gaps, not just functional literacy, reading, writing, and numeracy, but technological literacy, financial literacy, economic literacy, business literacy. A scarcity mindset that finds the person with a very short-term orientation. So that it's difficult to plan, it's difficult to think strategically. One's just trying to get through the month. An inability to focus on the business, sort of working in the business but not on the business because of non-business distractions tied to poverty. I'm being evicted, my kid's in trouble at school, my brother-in-law was coming over to babysit and got mugged. Now we're both at the hospital. I missed the meeting. And finally, lack of any kind of safety net, not qualifying for conventional debt or equity, no retained earnings, or if there are any in the business, they're used to support the family, no health insurance. And this produces a very conservative kind of orientation. So then we turn from entrepreneurship to poverty to the third part of this, which is the role of faith. And the research on in this area, a distinction is made between faith, religious affiliation, and religious commitment. And when we look at faith or a trust in a higher power, faith or religious commitment seem to have uh, significant implications for the venture creation experience, not so much religious affiliation per se. So, what have we found thus far? What does the literature tell us? Well, first of all, are the poor more religious? And the evidence is pretty clear that they tend to be. Uh, People in poorer nations are more religious than in wealthier nations. In a given nation, people in the lowest income bracket are more religious than the highest. Societies tend to become more secular as they develop and become wealthier. Um, at the same time, religious participation has been associated with better socioeconomic outcomes. Secondly, what about faith in adversity? Sustained poverty is associated with lower levels of individual control, higher levels of anxiety, both of which can turn somebody to a higher power. Faith can serve as a buffer between the negative effects of trauma and anxiety. In difficult times, people tend to rely more heavily on prayer and faith. Um, Faith is proven amongst low income women to be a source of stress management, a means of building social capital. So, as a vehicle for dealing with the adversity comes with entrepreneurship. Faith is a motivator, as a source of purpose in a venture. Um, the idea here is that the creation of the business is motivated by one's faith. In some cases, it is the purpose of the business. This concept of divine control, the extent to which an individual perceives God exerts a commanding authority over the course and direction of his or her life. The tendency to frame hardships and opportunities within the context of faith, which gives me hope, which motivates opportunity pursuit. Does faith affect actual entrepreneurial decision making? Um, in the Urban Poverty and Business Initiative that we coordinate, where we work with many low income and disadvantaged entrepreneurs, we find many of these entrepreneurs will pray over major decisions, ponder what God would want him or her to do, seek divine guidance, may be seeking God's blessing in the way decisions are made. Religious principles, values, and beliefs, creating a framework that guides how I approach decision making. And even in some instances, looking at the business in terms of workplace spirituality, where the meaningful work of the entrepreneur of building a venture um, nourishes spirituality. Faith is a source of resilience and stick-to-itiveness and persistence in the venture. Um, if I'm an entrepreneur and I see my venture as a partnership with God, I'm going to hang in there longer. I'm going to demonstrate more tenacity, be more perseverant. Belief in the will of God and the influence of the benevolence of a patron combined with grit is a source of resilience, a vehicle for dealing with adversity again. Um, and my faith becomes a vehicle for interpreting or sense making, even meaning making, when I encounter negative outcomes, when I encounter setbacks. It wasn't God's plan. It wasn't meant to happen in the scheme of things. A lot of attention paid in the literature to faith communities and the role they play both in bonding social capital and in bridging social capital. My faith community as a source of customers. Uh, my church is a vehicle for other resources, whether that's space or training. Um, my religious organization and community is a bridge to outside groups that may help my venture. Um, and the influence of one's religious community on decision heuristics that direct how I deal with uncertainty. At the same time, conflicts between faith and the entrepreneurial journey and the entrepreneurial decisions. So certain religions, Hinduism, have a lower propensity to be self-employed. Others are more encouraging of entrepreneurial behavior. Religions affecting entrepreneurship in terms of the kinds of behaviors they reinforce or encourage. So where religion encourages self-reliance or achievement, risk sharing, philanthropy, more positive impact on entrepreneurial behavior. At the same time, faith can create conflicts. Do I price to reflect value or simply a fair rate of return on my costs? Is it appropriate to reinvest profits in the business or they should be shared or distributed? Do I fire a problematic employee? And then, perhaps most importantly, where religious beliefs can lead to conservative approaches to decision making, to reinforcing gender-based stereotypes, to guilt, to depression. So our panel to discuss these and related issues include Brett Smith, who's a University Distinguished Professor and Life Endowed Professor of Faith and Entrepreneurship at Miami University in Ohio. Brett's research focuses on faith-based entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. He's founded both the Center for Social Entrepreneurship, but is the founding director of Life, leading the integration of faith and entrepreneurship at Miami University. He's published extensively in this area, and I'm curious as to his partnership with Bono and the U.S. Department of State. Mitchell Neubert is a Chavanne Chair of Christian Ethics and Business and Professor of Management at Baylor University. Mitchell's research focuses on how servant leaders, teams, and change processes affect the performance and flourishing of people and organizations, but critically, he's concerned with how faith intersects with these research interests. He's published in many leading scholarly journals. He's led a major NSF grant exploring the relationship between religion and entrepreneurship. He's authored 2 textbooks that stimulate critical thinking through adoption of both conventional and sustainable perspectives on theories and practices in management and organization behavior. So welcome both Brett and Mitchell to this conversation. I'd like to kick it off, if I could, please, with this question. We do through the Urban Poverty and Business Initiative a lot of work with low income and disadvantaged individuals, and we find viscerally that faith plays a prominent role in the entrepreneurial journeys of many of these individuals. As I've discussed, it affects their motives, the meaning and purpose of the venture to them, the principles around which they operate the business. We find an overwhelming ethic is, I'm starting this business to make my community better. I'm starting this business to hire people who look like me or come from where I come from. So they often tell us they need to pray. We give them some advice or some guidance, and I need to pray on that before I'm willing to do it. So why do you think faith plays a prominent role amongst these entrepreneurs?
Well, I'll go ahead and take a first shot. So first off, Mike, thank you so much for bringing this panel together. You have done so much for the field of entrepreneurship, and it's not surprising that now you take this new step into all the work around poverty and entrepreneurship and now faith. So thank you. It's a real honor to be here with you and, of course, with Mitch. Let me take a first pass at it. I think one thing that might be helpful is a little context. What I mean by that is there seems to be a resurgence. So if we look far enough back, like this is not a new topic. Like we can go back to William James and we can go get back to Max Weber and others. But what is different, or what seems to be different, is the size and scale at which this integration of faith and entrepreneurship is happening. I think that's true in practice. You see increasing number of organizations do this, and it's not just the entrepreneurs, it's the investors, it's the support organizations. And now you're seeing an increased amount of academic research sort of growing in this area. There's a couple of reasons for it, I think. One would be prevalence. The data still suggests that some 80% of the world claims a faith tradition. And so it's not surprising that therefore that might play a role. What is also important is for many of those people, it plays a central role. So it's not just another role. It's actually a central role, as you suggest, in their decision-making, in their worldview, in their identity. So it's the centrality of it as well. I think given where we are today, particularly in entrepreneurship, we have always been a multidisciplinary field. So we have always drawn from psychology, sociology, economics, among others. All three of those literatures have a deep, deep literature, and for decades, if not centuries, about doing work in this space. So it's not so new, and yet it provides novel answers. Like an economic paradigm, which much of the literature is based on, it's tough to explain something like social entrepreneurship. Where does it come from? Why is it here? And so what a faith perspective does is it acts as a complement to an economic perspective. It doesn't replace it. It actually rather allows us to think about, can we think about these things in tandem, and can we think about them concurrently? As it relates to our conversation today, I think if you look to somebody like Paul Tracy, he would suggest that an awful lot of the work that happens in social entrepreneurship is either by religious individuals and or organizations. So think of something like the Mondragon Cooperative in the Basque region of Spain, some 70,000 people in 150 different countries. This is driven largely by religious motivation. And so it really does play a prominent role in and around this space. And then maybe one final comment is often as this research began to take shape, people are like, oh, it's just another moderator. Just throw it in the variable and it's one little moderator. I think it's actually something different than that. I think if you look at the work of like Joanne Oxley, she would talk about shift parameters. And I think it's much more of a shift parameter than it is a moderator. So if you think about like changing distributions of opportunity, changing distributions of individuals and organizations and investors who might step into this space, I think that's actually what's happening. And that's why I think you see some of this, not just excitement, but also growth on both the practitioner side and the academic side.
So Brett, could you just elaborate on changing distributions, what you mean?
Sure, I think I think it opens it up. So sure, we'll go to Notre Dame. What a great example. But the Hallow app is a prayer and meditation app. It has raised $150 million in venture capital funding, not in grant funding, not in impact investing, in venture capital funding. And it is based primarily on a religious opportunity, this opportunity to pray and to meditate. And so what it's done, it's actually created a net new set of opportunities that didn't exist maybe before if we rule out sort of the religion variable. And so more than just, hey, it's a moderator, it's like, no, it's creating new sets of opportunity. It's creating new sets of support organizations. It's creating new investors who are investing now, yes, based in part on the opportunity and perhaps based in part on a faith perspective, or at least faith considerations in that overall financial investor equation.
Thank you for that. And Mitch, this opening question?
Yeah, glad to jump in. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's interesting. I'm not an entrepreneurship scholar per se. I come from management, and management and entrepreneurship share a lot of theories, and so there is some connection there. But one thing that kind of came to mind when I was hearing Brett was the idea that why is this kind of emerging a little bit more now than it was in the past? And my experience has been I've been trying to publish in this space for quite a while, and there's been a lot of resistance from the main journals including religion or spirituality as a central variable in any study. But the entrepreneurship folks or field, after a while, initially there was some pushback there too, but after a while have really kind of opened the door for let's take a look at the whole person and everything they bring to the table. And maybe that's not surprising, right? Entrepreneurs push against the status quo, right? So status quo was we can't talk about that. We can't talk about religion. And therefore it kind of limited what we could explain. But thankfully, entrepreneurship, I think, is taking a lead here in saying, hey, we have to look at everything that could account for the variance we see in these important variables, and religion and spirituality is part of that. So I'm going to definitely talk about some of my research, primarily about entrepreneurship, and I know you have some specific questions in mind, but I was going to take one step back also and say, early on in my interest in this area, David Miller helped kind of shape my thinking. David from Princeton, he's done a lot of work, kind of a deep kind of sociological review of different movements of faith and work, and certainly within that is entrepreneurship. And we've kind of been at it together as friends, like even trying to confirm if this is, some of the things he found is still true. But I do think there are still some things that hold true that then can apply to entrepreneurs. Just to kind of summarize maybe even some of the things that you just mentioned, it seems like there are at least four main categories of ways that people of faith bring that faith to work or manifest that faith. One is ethics. That might be the most common one that people have been open to exploring. It can and should, and particularly if you measure it right, and that's a key thing, right? If you try to measure affiliation, these things aren't going to play out at all. But if you do something like centrality or importance, then you can see that, yes, if it's really central to you, it's going to relate to ethical behavior. So one of those categories is we'd expect that it's going to shape the ethics and behaviors and related behaviors, of entrepreneurs as well as workers who have faith. So in addition to ethics, there's one that's expression. That's kind of this idea of some are motivated to start businesses, to behave in the workplace in a way that they express their faith, either through sharing it or demonstrating it. So that's a category of how conversations about this have happened over time and how it's been manifested over time. A third one where we've done some research on is enrichment, and that is that faith is a resource that you bring to work. And I think that's where we're going to kind of spend more of our time on some of these questions, is that it actually can act as a resource for an entrepreneur. You can pray, and from prayer, you can get the confidence that God's at work in the situation. You can read scriptures and get wisdom. There's a number of things around enrichment. You can draw on your faith tradition and manage kind of the meaning of situations based on your faith. So there's a lot there in terms of resource. And then the last one is that kind of a broader category about experience, is that faith has often evoked to bring meaning to context. My experience is altered, and my how I view that is altered based on my faith. And so I think those are four categories that are still helpful to keep in mind, and it's guided a little bit of my research in terms of like trying to figure out a little bit how each of those categories work out in the life of an entrepreneur. And even just to begin, one of the things that was just really obvious from some data we did in that NSF study is that because of, I think, the uncertain context of entrepreneurship, the risks that are associated with it, money on the line, we did find that entrepreneurs prayed more than full-time workers, right? They also saw God as more engaged, not distant. And so, entrepreneurs do manifest this faith that they have, for those who do have faith, in different ways than the kind of general working population. I think that's really interesting.
I want to build on a couple of points you made, Mitch, about the whole person. But there's an interesting question here that is related to the opening issue of why is this happening. Regina Frank posts a question. Isn't one of the reasons for the rise in the prevalence of faith tied to the explosion in the global population? She notes that the population has doubled in her lifetime. Is that a factor?
Well, I think Brett's comment points to part of it. I mean, in some ways, although we've been maybe perhaps predominantly Western institutions have been doing research on these topics, the world has been exploding, and in that exploding world of growth, it's been primarily communities of faith that are that are dominant in those spaces, and so it's just harder and harder to deny this proposition that was proposed, I think, a number of years ago that that the world's going to become more and more secular. It's actually probably becoming more and more religious, and so it's not dying off. It's actually growing in a lot of places, and so it becomes kind of this undeniable factor that people have to look at, even if it's maybe politically incorrect. I think people are realizing it's that variance unaccounted for that we really, if we're trying to be thorough researchers, that we have to look at. So.
Yeah, I think just to maybe respond to her comment, I think in part, of course, right? I mean, we're seeing lots of this happening in places like Africa. And so it's, again, not surprising, but I think Mitch's point is right. I mean, religion scholars will point to, the secularization thesis is, hey, the world's going to become more secular. And across space and time, that's just never proven to be true. In fact, if anything, the one thing that religious scholars will point to is that amongst all space, religion persists. Like, so every reason we think, the Enlightenment, or we're going to advance beyond this or whatever, and it actually turns out to not be the case. I think what is different here, though, is the willingness for people to bring it into the conversation. So the entrepreneurs are doing it for sure. I think, like in most spaces in academia, we lag rather than lead. So the entrepreneurs have been doing it. We're now catching up to this phenomenon. And that's true in social entrepreneurship, but that's true at the highest levels. Peter Thiel is having regular conversations when they fund organizations like Palantir. Like, these are, OpenAI. These are the leading companies in the world. And this is now an open conversation. Some people, as Mitch suggested, will say, it's because the entrepreneurs, in fact, listening to one of Peter Thiel's employees, Trey Stevens, he said, look, people would think that in Silicon Valley, this would be a conversation you can't have because it is so secular. He said it actually turns out to be a bit the opposite, that because people are so curious, they will even allow this conversation to persist. Like, they're just curious all of the time, and they're also curious about why they would be having this sort of a conversation. So I do think there are a number of factors. Of course, I think Regina is correct that definitely population would be part of it, but population doesn't explain why it would be exploding and increasingly integrated in the Western part of the world, where it does seem to be growing quite a bit.
So thank you for that. Mitch, you alluded to the whole person. I'm wondering if there's something about entrepreneurship itself that is a factor here. And at Notre Dame and here in the Keough School, we place a lot of emphasis on what we call integral human development, which is an outgrowth of Catholic social teaching, but it talks about the development of the whole person and the culturally, spiritually, socially, and otherwise. When we think about the attractiveness of entrepreneurship, and there's this long tradition in entrepreneurship research to distinguish what's called opportunity versus necessity-driven entrepreneurship, which I think has been pretty thoroughly debunked as a dichotomy, at least. But what we find with low income and disadvantaged entrepreneurs is their pursuit of entrepreneurship is not, even when necessity exists, even when they don't have other opportunities for employment. There are other motives at work that the entrepreneurial context is a potential source of identity, which we'll come back to, is a vehicle for me to express myself, to create something of my own, to have a voice. And I'm wondering how you react to that. That the context of entrepreneurship and this notion of the whole self is a factor.
Well, just a quick reaction is, what this is very simple, so maybe I'm a little bit outside of my lane here, but I mean, an entrepreneur, it's and an entrepreneurial endeavor is focused primarily on the entrepreneur and the person, right? As that organization gets larger and larger, it becomes more bureaucratic, and there's some benefits to bureaucracy we know, and in terms of efficiencies, but it becomes less human in some sense than the entrepreneurial endeavor, which is focused more on the entrepreneur and the whole perhaps self and the motives and the values of the entrepreneur. And so I think there's something about how an entrepreneur context still is focused on the person versus, it becomes the organization as it gets larger, and it's harder for maybe those values to be encouraged. So I mean, maybe that's one thing. But one thing kind of also that came to mind is like when we were doing this NSF study, and we did a number of interviews, which was a fantastic experience with entrepreneurs and full-time workers, and we honestly have not actually benefited as much as we should have from the wisdom in those interviews. But one publication with a graduate student, Jenna Greibo, we found that entrepreneurs, a lot of their motivations had to do with not being able to be authentically themselves in an organization. And so, yeah, they're for the faith-driven entrepreneur, or somebody who really wants to make sure that their faith-informed values were part of what they were living out in their workplace, that was a main reason for why they started a business. Now, they certainly had to have a good opportunity, and they had to have some skills to address that opportunity. But if those things were in place, then that was a big motivator, is that you wanted to be able to live out their values. And some of those values were more explicitly faith-based, like they wanted to be able to be more explicit and in their faith and voice it. But a lot of it was about just like, I want to live out my value of being at my kid's soccer game. And I can't do that when somebody else is calling the shots, right? So I want to be an entrepreneur that can be in an organization, and I know I might be working 90, 100 hours a week, but I still can call the shots on living out my values. And those values might be where I spend my time, how I treat my customers, all these things that kind of in a bureaucracy become limited. You can't make those decisions by yourself anymore. You have to kind of give those decisions over to the larger organization. So perhaps that's an initial comment, and Brett might have others, but.
Yeah, I think just one follow-on comment, maybe. I mean, an awful lot of the work on entrepreneurship is now tending towards other things like entrepreneuring. And I think this is an area where you do see the agency of the individual. And so an individual inside of a large corporation is going to have less agency than the entrepreneur. And therefore, I think there is some of this work going on. I think of the work of someone like Carolyn Essers, who's done some work with Muslim women in really unique contexts where they've actually allowed their faith to help them play a role to overcome some of the other traditional gender barriers that they might otherwise face. And so I think that you do see, yes, within entrepreneurship, there is this tendency, but also across different cultures and contexts, there's a way that faith can play different roles. In this case, it's an enabling or an entrepreneurial role that creates a bit more agency.
Thank you for that. Mitch, you've done work that explores how religious faith affects goal persistence and is associated with mental health and well-being of the self-employed. And this would seem to have implications for how they develop as entrepreneurs, how they develop new capabilities and new competencies. Um, could you talk a little bit about that research and some of the implications of your findings?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That was a project that Sean Dwyer led, and you're basically looking at a large data set of self-employed individuals, but it was in the U.S. and frankly, we didn't divide it up related to economic status or in terms of poverty that we're talking a little bit about. But I think it does reinforce kind of my earlier comment that one of these main areas that people manifest their faith is in enrichment, or that faith is a resource, and so religious coping, this capability to kind of draw on your faith, right, to deal with difficulties in an entrepreneurial context, seems intuitively, justifiable. But our data then actually proved that relationship exists, meaning, your faith and however you draw on your faith, again, through wisdom, prayer, encouragement, hope, optimism, all those things can relate to you persisting in a real difficult, uncertain context like entrepreneurship. But the interesting part of the study was really then realizing maybe some more specific ways that it was impacting the entrepreneur. And so we found out, we looked at kind of a construct broadly, Udemy kind of view of like mental health and well-being, and found out that if that entrepreneurs who are kind of expressed that religion was helping them cope, that it actually was impacting persistence by affirming or encouraging kind of purpose and meaning in what they were doing, right? Another one was it was helping them respond to or kind of translate challenges, and maybe even taking those challenges and turning them into growth opportunities, like in many traditions, at least the Christian tradition, a trial is an opportunity for growth. We may not welcome it, but it's an opportunity for growth. And so we found out that religious coping helped in terms of personal growth and looking at circumstances which could be very difficult and discouraging. But if you look at it from a spiritual perspective, you could say, hey, I'm learning something about this, and my character is improving based on this. And so you continue to do it because you see there's something good in it, so you persist in it. And the last one just, I think, was about this idea about mastery and how coping kind of helped you have this kind of learning orientation that you could grow and learn. And I think also, not really in the measure, but I mean, also you have this extra kind of confidence that you can be competent and keep moving because you're drawing on the resources of your faith and believing that you have, in most faith traditions, an active God that is helping you along the way, right? So I mean, religious coping was just proven through those three mechanisms, to fully mediated through those mechanisms, to impact goal persistence.
This issue of mental health intrigues me a lot. Given the stress that the low-income person deals with, the sense of fatigue that they deal with, but we've also found in our own work this phenomenon amongst low-income and disadvantaged entrepreneurs. Not so much fear of failure, it's a factor, but fear of success, and the costs associated with success, and that kind of fear can actually lead to self-sabotage within the business. I wonder if you have any thoughts about faith as maybe a countervailing force, faith's role in how I see success, in mitigating the perceived costs of success, in avoiding the sort of self-sabotaging behaviors that may not be intentional, may be intentional.
Well, I'll make a quick comment, then maybe Brett has some comment about this. So again, a project with Sean, he interviewed and a set of folks who are in a development context. In Africa, definitely in a subsistence kind of environment. And so this gets to part, I think, what you're asking me, and if not, you can ask me again, or ask Brett to answer. But I think in some of those contexts, there's a concern about if you become successful that you stick out too much in a context where it's important to conform and in collective societies, right? And so we did kind of read about some of these. I read some of these transcripts where they would get pressures from other people that if they were too successful, right, that they maybe was the success alone was signaling that they weren't like they didn't have concern for the other people in the village or community, or that they had forsaken their values as a person of faith because faith was faith might have been associated with poverty, not success, right? So they dealt with some of these things that you mentioned a little bit, like how successful can I be? Because if I become too successful, I'm going to be ostracized in some ways from the community and the people like me. I think that's a challenge that they were just wrestling with. And I don't have the answer about how they dealt with it, but I think they ultimately had to reframe what they were doing as business as not being this secular, uh, contrary activity, but that God could be honored in it. And it could be this thing that could actually help the community. So I think it helped them. They were wrestling with framing what entrepreneurship was because the outside forces were framing it as negative. Like if you're successful, then you perhaps have abandoned the faith or you're not being faithful to our community. So I don't know if that helps, or maybe Brett has some follow-up thoughts.
Just two quick things that maybe follow along the same lines. The first is that you mentioned there at the end is sort of overcoming this dualism of like I have my faith life and my entrepreneurial life, right? And I think what a lot of the work in this space is focused on, at least right now, is that may be one understanding, but what actually happens when you integrate these things, when you bring these things together and they don't stand off as what the religion side may call like a sacred secular divide or Sunday Monday gap, but instead you bring these things together. I think it does allow people to become unlocked a bit more. Maybe the other part of that, Mike, you asked like what happens on the high ends or during success. We had a study sort of looking at the identity of the entrepreneurs, and of course we expected that their entrepreneurial identity would be low and they would struggle when the business struggled. Not surprising, their identity was also, inflated in their own words when the business went really well. But what was interesting is they said to us, when the business went well, when their entrepreneurial identity was high, it was actually the most concerning part of their identity. And that it was actually this faith perspective that did act as this countervailing force to keep some like identity stability. Like we don't need to name names, but we know plenty of entrepreneurs who have been very successful in one area who think they may be successful or tell other people how to do other areas. But it is this issue where faith may play a role in our study. It was actually a humbling role, humbling them out of this identity high and because of their faith identity, this interaction between these identities, making it much more like identity stability is what we were talking about. And so I do think there's a piece of that that's definitely true.
That's quite intriguing, quite intriguing. And Brett, you also talk about, you alluded to this a little bit before, but from a different vein. But you talk about the impact of faith on optimism and that it affects how people look at opportunity, how they perceive opportunity, the extent to which an opportunity is perceived to be more attractive or desirable. But also, so I'm more optimistic. I'm more prone to opportunity pursuit, but also fueling overconfidence. Can you talk a bit about these findings?
Sure. So we did a study, and what we were really trying to do are two things. The first of which is maybe a more macro level comment, which is, and I think Mitch alluded to it as well. I think as we increasingly do more research in and around the area of faith and entrepreneurship, we have to continue to get better collectively at theoretical specification. So why is it that we would expect something to be different? And part of that means we have to get better at the theory side of religion too. There's an awful lot to work with there. Sometimes that means interdisciplinary work and other things. But this was one of the papers where we tried to do that and get at what would theoretical specification mean here. So here we were looking at the degree to which entrepreneurs did or did not bring their religious beliefs, what was called sanctification, actually imbuing a secular activity or a daily activity with a religious lens. And so what we're trying to do is compare those that sanctified this perspective from those that didn't. And did we see any differences when they were looking at and evaluating opportunities? So it was, when do I bring those religious beliefs in? And then how does that affect how I look at opportunity cues? The first finding is not surprising, but it was important, which is if the data is unambiguous, it's very clear it's going to work or it's not going to work, we see no difference whatsoever between those that bring their religious views in and those that don't. If the data is clear, the data is clear. Religion effectively doesn't matter under that scenario. Where it did matter quite a bit is when the data was ambiguous, when the data had some gaps that we had to fill in. And what we found in our study is that when people brought their religious beliefs into that environment and had ambiguous cues from the opportunity, they tended to be more likely to view that as both feasible and desirable. And so they were willing to be more optimistic about the prospects than maybe the data would suggest. So I think there's two parts coming out of that. One is like, okay, that may suggest that they are more likely to act. Okay. Secondly, that may or may not be a good thing, right? So I think we need to be willing as scholars to look at, regardless of whether you do or don't share a faith tradition, we need to be willing to look at both sides of the equation. When are things positive? In this case, maybe it does make someone more likely to act, but also what's the potential downside? Do they act at a time when maybe more due diligence was necessary, or maybe they're acting even though it would suggest maybe they shouldn't act? And so I think as we continue to do more work in this space, a lot of people are saying, hey, we have to look at some of the downsides. I think that is true, but I think we actually have to have a really balanced view. There are ways to do that. Have people on your team who don't share your faith tradition. Have people who have no faith at all, right? There's lots of ways we can do this, but I think to consider both what are the potential upsides, but also what are the potential blind spots or downsides.
So if faith can make me more optimistic and faith can make me see viability in an opportunity that the evidence isn't necessarily clear about. Mitch, you talk about religious orthodoxy as negatively impacting entrepreneurial risk-taking. So that would seem not necessarily counter, but certainly conflicting with what Brett has told us. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Well, yeah, and I was just thinking about this. That was written with Todd Ferguson, and he took the lead on that. And I was kind of hoping when before we knew how the data was going to turn out, I was kind of hoping it was going to turn the other way. That those people who have this kind of religious orthodoxy, which is really kind of a clear kind of belief and commitment to God as an external authority, as well as one who has revealed what's right and wrong in sacred scriptures. Somebody who believes that those things are true, that God is doing those things, then tends to be a little bit more risk averse. I just was kind of hoping, cheering for it to be the opposite way, for the sense of the optimism, right? I thought, well, maybe these folks will realize that God's active and he can help you, he can encourage you. But I think the reality is that, and again, I'm probably, from the perspective of my own faith, kind of some of these comments maybe are narrower, but somebody who's in one church, Christian church, can look at a set of scriptures or a body of scriptures and come away with a one point of view. They might come away with, God really, what he's really concerned about is me following the rules. Like I've got to follow the rules. And that's been historically a big part of some of our churches, and that it's really been about rule following. And so you certainly can get that out of the scriptures with the Ten Commandments and other things that Jesus outlines in the New Testament. But if you also kind of look at it, another person might come to that and look at it and say, well, there's things there about following the rules, but there's so much more about like doing good and stepping out and going and impacting and growing, right? And so this is maybe a terminology that not everyone's familiar with, but I think that a lot of our churches have reinforced what's called a prevention focus and mindset in people. And this prevention focus versus a promotion focus is kind of a terminology that's a catch-all for a lot of different types of research that have used those kind of two constructs somewhat. One that's more like loss avoidance, security seeking, risk aversion, right? That's the prevention. And then the promotion is growth seeking, gain oriented, right? And development oriented. And so I do think that some of those church members who filled out our survey, this survey was of U.S. People in churches, were in churches where maybe they had focused on the rules and the boundaries and more so than actually the opportunities that God presents to us and wants us to be involved in, that more promotion-oriented set of things. So in this particular study, kind of I think the prevention mindset kind of won out, and we saw that more people who had that orthodox view that has set the rules and he's the final authority would cause them to not want to step out of line and take a lot of risks. But I think we see just even by the growth of the church overall over history that there are people who definitely are promotion oriented, going, doing, gaining, growing. And so I don't think we're necessarily being orthodox and believing those things about God means that we have to be avoiding risks. But yeah, that's the way the data turned out. So that's the way we presented it.
Yeah, let me just add one quick thing on a study we're just finishing up now, and the context is actually monks, and it's monks that run social enterprises. And what we were actually trying to understand is part of their decision-making process around creativity. Because I think at a macro level, you will hear, oh, religion, hinders creativity or entrepreneurship, or religion promotes creativity or entrepreneurship. And I think part of our challenge is to continue to go deeper in understanding the mechanisms between how and why. Like, how does it actually work, rather than using, some very coarse level variable. So in this study, we were actually looking at the constraints around creativity, and it was like, oh, well, it's going to hinder it by providing some constraints. We actually found that's true, and it does something else. So it actually creates the boundaries around where they may be creative, but within those boundaries, they had sort of unlimited creativity within the boundaries that they saw. And so it's actually a both and I think this is true of religion in general, that we have to go a little bit deeper in terms of how we think about this. And I also think there is a lot of heterogeneity, not only between religions, we know that, but within religions. And getting down to what is the actual understanding of any group of people is really, really important if we're going to try and use that to then predict some action. So I think getting down to a granular level of mechanism and heterogeneity really helps us sort of understand the field a bit better.
So I want to go in a different direction. I did note somebody asked if we would put in the chat the name of the paper about business opportunity and satisfaction. But Donna, one of our participants, she asked the question, she raises faith leading to bad business decisions or bad outcomes that might not have happened in secular situations. And so the larger question is, we seem to be focusing on positive impacts of faith. You had alluded to, Brett, to overconfidence as a potential negative, but what are some of the other potential negative aspects or impacts of strong faith on entrepreneurial decision making, on the entrepreneurial journey?
Well, I'll say one quick, you referenced the article we published about goal persistence, religious coping, and goal persistence. And I think goal persistence or persistence in anything can have drawbacks, right? So from a like a general management principle, like if you persist or escalate your commitment to a course of action, there can be downsides if you don't take in contrary information and be willing to change. And maybe entrepreneurial language, you might not pivot if you feel like, well, God told me to do this, I'm just going to keep moving along, and he'll bail me out even if the circumstances look like they're grim. And so there might be this sense of not pivoting quickly enough when you should, when the data suggests you should, because you're looking at factors or you're considering factors that are other than the data. So I think that's part of it. One other thing we didn't prove this in our study, but I was wanting to bring this study up just for the discussion here too. One of the ones that's most the study that I've done that's closest to this that I led with, and then Steve Bradley here at Baylor was part of that team, and it was about spiritual capital. And we did talk about primarily, honestly, and we can maybe revisit this, the positive aspects of spiritual capital. And one of those was that those with higher levels of spiritual capital, which was a faith importance measure, faith maturity measure, more employees wanted to work at the organization. But I think, you referred to this in the earlier comment about it. That could mean that same thing where you attract employees means you might be more hesitant to let an employee go when they merit being let go. So that also might be like a tangible example of perhaps when there's a downside because you let, and this may not be wrong, certainly for the person, they may make a decision based on their values that might be contrary to what might make economic sense.
Yeah, I think maybe just a couple others. So, and again, these are illustrative more than anything else. So continuing down that path, one is, if I share that faith with someone else, maybe it will attract team members, maybe it will attract capital. Yes, or maybe it will push it away. So if I don't share that faith, am I now ostracizing myself? And because I've been very overt about my faith, whatever that is, if I don't share that, does that become an impediment, or are there judgments? So we did a study looking at how investors view the sharing of faith in pitch decks, and some of the findings actually aren't all that surprising. That a faith-based investor, of course, would like it, and a non-faith-based investor would not. But what was more interesting is why. And the reality is the investor did not perceive the business any better. They didn't perceive the opportunity any better. It was actually just a function of trust. They trusted the individual because they shared that faith. And so there is one possibility. The second maybe is weightier or loftier expectations and the weight that puts on the entrepreneur, right? So we could think about this even in social entrepreneurship. Like the fear of failure in social entrepreneurship is more than the individual, because now it's these people who may desperately be beneficiaries and need the help. And if I fail now, I don't just fail me, I fail them. Well, what if I now also fail God? Like, so there is this loftier expectation, potentially this greater weight, if you will, upon it. And then going a bit of a different direction, we often think about how does faith affect entrepreneurship? But there is, of course, the reverse, which is how does entrepreneurship affect faith? In our study, while we didn't have enough data to talk about it, when we had the highs and lows and how faith sort of counterbalanced it, we had a couple of people talk about that is how it went, but it need not go that way. Meaning that when my business goes down, my faith may help reaffirm me, it may bounce me up, or it may actually take my faith down. So it may, the entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial outcomes may actually be a detriment to me continuing on in my faith. And so I think there's sort of three different ways to think about it. There's lots of different ways, but those are three different examples that paint possible paths of how do we consider negatives or downsides.
Yep. One other comment on that is Matt Wood and I did a study using kind of a conjoint methodology, if you're familiar with that, where respondents look at a bunch of different scenarios. And what we were trying to get at is how would applicants respond to different manifestations of faith by an entrepreneur. So, and similar to what Brett said, if you were a person of faith, which we gathered that information about the respondents, then when an entrepreneur expresses faith in whatever way, that's perceived as more positive. And if you're a person that's not of faith, it's more negative. So real obvious there. But there were a couple of things that jumped out that were pretty interesting. One was that we had two different kinds of ways that somebody would manifest their faith. One was the entrepreneur themselves would say, yeah, I've started this business to glorify God, and and kind of lead with that. That was part of the scenario. And then the other one was that the entrepreneur would hand the applicant a set of materials that had faith-based slogans on it, or justifications like written on the materials. And people responded less. Those people who didn't share the views responded less negatively to the personal, authentic expression of faith by the entrepreneur than they did actually like materials, like labeling it, like, putting it out there. And I think we described it as maybe their hesitation was to do this kind of faith washing. Like, is this person have this stuff on the materials because they really believe it, or are they just trying to get new customers, or they think that I want to hear it, and so it's labeled that way. So it was an interesting finding that kind of, again, the main findings were just very similar, that expressing faith could actually help you land some employees, or could hinder you from landing some great talent. But there's also how you do it could affect people's perception, which was kind of interesting.
We bring it back to the poverty context. I think in terms of how many of our entrepreneurs, and this issue you raised, Brett, of letting down my community, letting down the people that allowed me to survive in poverty, my neighbors and so forth, is omnipresent. But I see things like a tendency to underprice, to charge lower prices. Then I often talk to the entrepreneurs we work with about my daughter, and how she will pay $7.50 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks, trying to convince them to endorse more value-based pricing, but I think faith plays a role in that tendency to, well, I know I need to charge a fair price. I need to charge a price that I would pay, or what have you. So I think there are many decisions in the business that might enable growth and development of the business that one resists because of certain faith-based values. I did want to weave in some more of the questions from the audience. We have a question from Helen about whether you see any synergy or relationship between a faith mindset and the so-called entrepreneurial mindset. Is that something you might have a perspective on?
We have not done any research on it, but because we've done enough qualitative research, you see bits and pieces again. So more anecdotal than anything else. I think, as Mitch talked about, sort of this prevention idea, right? I think sometimes people will immediately equate a religious perspective with rules-based following and all of that, or even more of a fixed mindset. I think we see huge heterogeneity across that, because I think you will see just as many people who will say, no, because of my faith, I'm willing to. I look at Rob Pittick and David Townsend and Lil Busenit's study on the whole idea about embracing uncertainty because of these different faith perspectives. And that's actually creating more risk seeking or more growth oriented sort of behavior. So I think, honestly, I think we just don't have a lot of research on it, and we haven't gone deep enough. We've sort of we've settled for, hey, there's this big idea and religion hinders or religion helps. And I think it's more nuanced than that. I think it's more complicated, and we have to do deeper dive research to get at some of those mechanisms. But those would be starting points about how it may contribute to one or the other.
Yeah, in our own work on the entrepreneurial mindset, we argue it's a multidimensional construct itself. And so the conventional notion that the mindset is about a growth orientation or innovation, well, that might be a dimension that's less important in this context, whereas the mindset that it's about resiliency, that it's about creative approaches to getting around resource constraints might be more consistent with the faith orientation. Another question from a different participant. Given that entrepreneurs may pursue opportunities for different values, should this influence how we measure the performance of startups? So it starts to introduce other variables other than return on investment as a metric. What are your thoughts about that? Outcome measures, performance measures.
Well, I think I'm all for, actually, maybe that ties into my introduction. I'm all for kind of looking at multiple forms of well-being, and financial being one of them, and feeling like it's very limited if we only measure startups based on that. Though certainly I admit you have to have a profit to continue. So I think just real quickly, this article that we did on spiritual capital with Steve Bradley in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, we didn't actually measure. We measured innovations, employees, as kind of some of our main kind of variables there. And so it wasn't necessarily how much money they were making. That ended up being a control variable. And the interesting part about that one was, we controlled for the amount of capital they were given in this microfinance context they had. We had social capital controlled for. We even had optimism as a psychological capital variable that we controlled for. But above that, accounting for all those things, spiritual capital still did predict if entrepreneurs are willing to differentiate and innovate. And I think that kind of comes to this confidence, that faith can imbue in us, and also number of employees. But one thing I want to make note of, and this is maybe kind of looking at some of these other questions in here too, is I think faith impacts what the entrepreneur does and how they view things, certainly. And that's a really interesting area. But I think it also, as we've alluded to a couple of times here, it also impacts how other people view the entrepreneur. And in development context in particular, at least perhaps not in the US as much, but in developing context, there's really huge institutional voids. You can't count on enforcement of law. There's not contracts. Things don't work well. And so you can't, like in the US, typically count on those pillars of institutional capitalism to help you. And so what are you left with? You're left with informal judgments as a customer or a potential employee, like, can I trust this person? And so a person of faith, hopefully, and in most cases we see this, a person of faith is evidencing the values of integrity, maybe even the values of optimism that are going to attract customers and employees in a context where they have to rely on the character of the entrepreneur, because they can't rely on the government to come in and fix things if they get cheated, or provide warranty for a remedy for an action. And so I do think that that's also an important area we need to research, is like, how other people perceive the actions of the entrepreneur and the values that they are espousing as well as enacting in their businesses.
Yeah, Mike, on the measurement side, it reminds me a little bit of the early days of social entrepreneurship, right? Everyone's like, oh, we need a second or a third bottom line that we need to. I think you're seeing some of that work going on now in practice, we did a study in Journal of Business Ethics around looking at impact investors, and they were faith-based impact investors. And the question was, how did they actually manage these different identities, a financial identity, a social identity, and a faith-based identity? And the long and short of it was they end up having to sacrifice at least part of these identities. But that's a word coming straight out of theology, right? That is a word that has real imbued meaning, but yet it has real theoretical meaning for us in and around this space. So we can use the theology to theorize into management. But I think the other thing that was interesting in that study is different impact investors did different things. For some, they needed to have some minimum requirement of financial return, of social return, and of some faith-based return that they were measuring, counting. For others, they equated social return as faith-based return. So if I'm feeding X number of people, that's good. And I don't now need to measure a faith thing. That is their embodiment of a faith-based practice. And so I think you're seeing some mixture about how people are thinking about, do I need a separate bottom line, or are those bottom lines highly correlated?
So we're about out of time. This could go on because this is so fascinating, but Ivory asked an intriguing question that I'm wondering how you would answer this. He says, how do you interpret the direct guidance that entrepreneurs claim to have received from God when they believe God told them to do something?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. Trust but verify. I don't know. I'm a little hesitant when somebody claims to have direct communication from God, and maybe they are, but I tend to want to verify, like provide. Do you have any other reasons why that's a good idea? Can you give me some more data? Hopefully do that in a respectful way that doesn't dishonor their enthusiasm about the idea. But I don't know, Brett, maybe you have something much more tangible.
Well, I think, of course, it depends, right? What's the best answer? But it depends on your theoretical and your methodological approach, right? I do an awful lot of qualitative research. And so if we're coming at it from a sense-making approach, we have to approach what they say as what they're doing. I think there's an awful lot of work increasingly in what we call lived religion that says, quit telling me what you believe and start showing me your actions, and I'll know what you believe based on how you acted. And so I do think in and around this space is this question of beliefs versus actions, and how do we do enough research to understand those things?
Well, I want to thank you both. This has been so educational for me, and I hope for our audience. To our audience, thank you for being with us today. The video of this session will be available on the Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship website, which is on the Notre Dame site. For anybody that would like to join the Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship, there is no cost. Just get a hold of me, and we'll add you to the group. And again, thanks to our excellent panelists for a provocative discussion.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here. If I could just share one possible thing that might be useful to the audience. At our Center for Life, we do a lot of work in this space, including we have a bibliography that people can have access to. There are special issues that are out there. The growth in the field, at least at the highest levels, is actually doubling. It has in the last 5 years. It has again in the last 5. Like, we'd love this as an entrepreneur. This is the kind of growth we're after. And if you want any access to, it's all free. It's all there. It's all available. Feel free to download it. That's not a plug for us. That's just to say this is an emerging field. There's growing work out there, and you don't have to start at ground zero. There are conferences, there are special issues, there are bibliographies. Please take advantage of it and continue to contribute.
Thanks for that, Brett, and thanks for your leadership in this area, and Mitch, thanks for your perspectives.
Absolutely.
That's it. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Pleasure.